Richard, Holly in her introduction said that you were a student here. Could we start you saying when that was?
Yeah, not exactly this building, but at the London College of Printing it was. And I was in what was the Foundation Annex building, which is the road that runs up to London Bridge. So it's off from the roundabout, and I think it's now a block of, you know, apartments. But then it was like a lot of the buildings featured in your film, William. It was an industrial building, and the whole area was industrial. And of course, when the industry was moving out of London, everything became derelict. But the college had this building, it was a new building, and then they had that one on the corner. And I'd applied because I thought I was going to be doing graphic design. I thought, you know, that's what I wanted to do. But I realised halfway through the course that in actual fact I wasn't actually using my hands. I mean, I was in a very two-dimensional way, and really I was a maker. And a group of us sort of explained it to a couple of the tutors, and they just hived off a bit of the studio for us. And we were allowed to get on with, you know, making sculpture. Certainly there was some assistance through tutorials. And then at the end of the year I moved on. I didn't stay here to do graphic design, which is what a lot of the students did. And I applied to Hornsey College of Art. And I went there in 1971. So I was here in 1970, and it was a very, very different place.
Fabulous. Interesting about what you say about making things with your hands, because also, I mean, I have to say a huge thank you for your memories in that film.
They're not all there, but yeah.
But I mean, that was done in one interview session I did with Richard. He knew I wanted to record his voice for the film, and he invited me round for breakfast with Miyako. And after breakfast, we went off upstairs and recorded almost exactly a year ago today. I was looking up the date on the recording.
Interesting.
And all those memories come from one recording session. And of course, I edited out, I had to, an awful lot of very interesting things that you said.
Absolutely, yeah.
The way one has to. But it just sort of occurred to me. I thought it was an inspired idea of Natalie to have the in conversation with you and me, because I think your practice is still very much all about making things in the way that so many of those shows that you remembered at Act.
Yeah, and I think generated very much from that early period where it was like, you know, on the one hand, get by and make do. None of us had any money, but we all somehow kept our art going. And I think Anne summed up something very interesting, Anne Bean, when she said, you know, that there was no differentiation between living and making art. It all became one thing. You slept art, you woke and had art for breakfast, and then you made other bits of art during the day, and someone would call round and you'd make that an art experience. Then you'd go off. Now I did a postgraduate in 1974 to 76 at Reading University, and a lot of what you see, the people you see in the film, a lot of those people came out of that university, strangely enough. It wasn't an art college, it was titled a university, but they gravitated back to London. I ended up in 76 back at Butler's Wharf. And that was a very interesting colony. You know, I went to space studios in the same way as Richard Deacon pointed out, that they were a bit sort of, you know, a bit too neat and tidy, actually. And I went and saw the director there and said, I'm looking for a space. And he said, I can put you on the list. And I said, well, how long's the list? And it was about a 2-year waiting list for a studio with that organisation. And I said, well, listen, I've been hearing some interesting rumours about Butler's Wharf on the south side of the river at Tower Bridge. And he said, I'll stop you there. Don't go there. It's rough. It's going to fall apart. You know, you need to carry a gun if you go that side of the river. And I was immediately fascinated. And I left that office and I went straight there. And I met with Anne Bean, and I took on W11 block. I took a 3,000 square foot space on the second from top floor of a smaller studio there. And it cost me £60 a quarter for 3,000 square feet. And I lived and worked there. Yeah. And it was very much a New York setup in terms of lifestyle, because what happened, it was it was very isolated in one sense. So it was a very, very sort of dense community, an enclosed community. You had Tower Bridge Road, you had the river, you had St Saviour's Creek, and then you had, I don't know if it was Druid Street or was it Jamaica Road, a busy road up to the Rotherhithe Tunnel. So no one ever came into that enclave, and it just became the artist's community. And Anne Bean had these enormous parties once a month, once every 2 weeks. You'd have Rolls Royces pulling up. You had the Baumgartens having big studio parties with all sorts of bands coming along and playing. And people would they'd start waking around about midday, and they would work right the way through till about midnight. And the only other occupants in that area were the Courage Brewery. And they had their own pub for their workers who could go in there any time, day or night. It was a 24-hour pub. And so at midnight, you'd go down to what we called the living room. Myself, Jock McFadden, Steve Cripps, Paul Burwell, Anne, everyone. We'd go down there and we'd sit in there till about 4 or 5 in the morning drinking. And then you'd go to sleep and, you'd wake up the following afternoon. So it wasn't like what I'm into now. I get up at 7 and I'm really good in the morning, and about 4 o'clock I'm flagging. I need a bit of a sweetener to keep myself going. And in the evening, I need to unwind. I need to watch a movie or do something else. But it was the complete opposite of that. I mean, it was to do with the age as well, and it was to do with the energy.
Yeah.
So
do you remember Derek Jarman's famous
Derek?
cleaning parties?
Yeah. Well, there were so many. There was the Logan brothers, certainly Andrew Logan, the organizer, the founder of the Alternative Miss World. Andrew Logan had a studio on the very top floor of A Block. I don't know if you ever went to any of those. And you'd walk up all these stairs right up this to the 6th floor, and then you'd bang on the door. And he always had a doorman who was like always semi-dressed, like either a pair of sort of plastic trunks on or something. And you'd go in there, and of course Andrew Logan had done the Bieber roof for Bieber in South Ken or West Ken, wasn't it? And so he'd kept a lot of those corn ears that he'd made for the Bieber shop. And so the door would open, and the first thing you did is you went over a bridge, and there was a running river running round the studio. So you'd go over, running water, and then you'd enter this kind of garden, which was all the leftovers from that Bieber situation. And you'd just have these big rave parties. So, and Derek had the same situation. The thing about Derek's parties, they were always a bit weird, because he always had the toilet in the middle of the room on a plinth, as like a sculpture work, with like a little thing you could pull round you if you needed to. Not many people used it. So there's some very bizarre, interesting situations that took place. The other thing that Derek did, which is really good, was that he would give over 1 month, one day of the month, and it was usually a Sunday afternoon, a lunchtime afternoon, where he would invite anybody in the area who was a filmmaker with Super 8. He would provide beanbags, drink, and the equipment. And you'd get people calling in with rolled up bits of film and saying, I want to show this. And you'd come across and go up and have something to eat and drink, and you'd spend the afternoon watching movies that people made. And it was quite a fascinating thing that he put together there. It didn't sustain itself, but just little things like that, which were very generous and made a very good and strong sense of the community at Butler's Wharf.
And there were other places, that other artists talk about in the film. The London Filmmakers Co-op formed in 1966. It's coming up to its 50th anniversary. London Video Arts.
London Musicians Collective.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course Acme, which...
Acme was sort of in the middle of it all in Covent Garden. Yeah. But also you were involved in setting up artist studios at Chisholm Hill Art Space, weren't you?
Yeah, that was much later on, 1981, after the big fire at Butler's Wharf. We were all asked to leave. It wasn't realised that all of us were living illegally there. And it was a very organic colony. There was over 200 artists by 1981. And it started with a dribble, and you'd go in, you'd take a space, and then more people would arrive, and people would subdivide. It was a bit like sort of any art college in those days, where you'd build your little cubicle and live there. But of course, all the living was kept very low key. So like I had 3,000 square feet, but I had a long wall where I had sculptures, but they were all kind of glued on, and I could slide the whole wall back and you'd go in, there's the living area, But it was, yeah, I mean, it was just one of those extraordinary situations to be in. I mean, and yeah, I mean, Acme, I think, grew out of that. But as I say, going back to Butler's Wharf, after the fire, there were a couple of stragglers that were left. You know, I was included in that. People had moved on, some had left London, etc. And I was looking around, and it was evident that there wasn't much left up by the river in southeast London. Unless you went way downriver. So I went north of the river, not to live, but to look for a space. And so after 1981, it must have been about 1982, very early 83, I found Chisholm Hill and became the building manager and put it together. Took 10 months out of my, sculpture career doing that. And then I left shortly afterwards after finishing it. I discovered I didn't really want to go back into something that wasn't going to be better than what the Butler's Wharf experience was, and it wasn't giving me that feeling.
I've got a question for you, and it's a tricky one, and I don't think there's an easy, simple answer. But it's something that you touched on earlier in terms of this immediate location, which now is rapidly becoming very gentrified around the Elephant and Castle. And I'm wondering, to what extent do you think that, let's call it radical work, especially in performance art, installation, things that didn't conform to what you'd expect to go
Outside
and
the
see
box,
in the Tate
yeah.
or whatever, outside the box. To what extent do you think that sort of development, that kind of growth of practice in those areas might be to do with the availability of cheap housing, cheap studio space? And whether perhaps, one might think in terms of, the evolution of the YBA generation, where it becomes all much more corporate and tied to a more commercial art.
Yeah, well, I know just through hearing through the grapevine, the thing about the YBA situation that happened in, what was it, the late 90s, or was it in the 2000s?
Early mid-90s.
When I was at Hornsey College of Art, there was no market.
No.
It wasn't about making art because you were going to make a fast buck. There were artists who were doing that, but they were of a particular generation that were much older than us ex-students, as it were, students ex-students. And so one sort of had this idea that, you've actually got to serve an apprenticeship, the old-fashioned idea that you've got to be in the game for quite a few years before you're going to put money in your pocket. And Jock pointed that out in your film so well.
Yeah, you might sell a watercolour by the time you're 50.
Yeah. But the kind of teaching practice that was happening out in the 90s wasn't so much that what I experienced, which is, okay, you've made this. There's a lot of rubbish on the planet. Why is that any better than anything else that's rubbish? And you were constantly having to justify your ideas, and they were quite formal ideas, but you had weeks where you'd put up shows and you'd have students in, you'd have the tutors in, and you'd get bombarded by, why is that there and what's it all about? And I think what was happening, or what I understood from Goldsmiths, it was like, okay, it's there. Where's it going to go after it's there? It's in your studio. How are you going to locate it in a gallery? How are you going to sell it? How are you going to position it in a collection or a museum? So the emphasis was I wouldn't say it was so much about commercialism, but it was very much about like the life of the piece of work outside of the studio.
Yeah.
Whereas Acme, Butler's Wharf, and the way a lot of people were working, there was no real distinction between studio and gallery. You'd spend a week disrupting your space at home, and then you might say to some people, come and have a drink, come and have a look what I've been doing, and you put a show on. It's a bit like the open studio situation that people have now.
Yeah.
And so that kind of, because there were no divisions, I think there was a kind of a freedom about the way work could exist. And that often, certainly with my early work, I started to enlist parts of the building as part of the work, which made it incredibly difficult to be commercial. But it made it extremely fun to be able to sort of undo something that you'd put together the previous year. You'd built a room, and then you think, right, okay, I'm going to take the floor out and start doing something where people walk in on a platform, like a diving board or something like that, because you had that freedom. When someone says to you, this building is derelict, it no longer has any use, you can do what you want with it, suddenly, the freedom there is quite considerable. It's only when you start to enclose and tie down and restrict that's what happens to ideas. And unfortunately, I mean, I don't want to sound sour about it, but unfortunately I feel at the moment there is a restriction. It's called health and safety, and bureaucracy. And the other thing is there is a restriction in that the gallery no longer really will entertain disruption. Yeah. So you'd never get Steve Cripps doing what he was doing. Health and safety, if you damage someone's ears, I'll be sued. Sorry, you can't do it. That kind of thing. And also, the gallery has become a kind of sacred, sacrosanct thing where, it's almost more precious than the work itself. And so if you went in there and you said, I would like to do this, that, and the other, there was once upon a time you could do that. There's very, very few places that can do that. And the only one I can think of in London now is the Matt's Gallery. Yeah. That's the only place where who came out at the same period, but went on a tangent in a different way to Acme, but they were working, well, I suppose, in tandem, and were very much aware of each other. And funny enough, share the same building now, over in Copperfield Road, or Copperfield Street. But Robin was someone who invited in similar artists, and like Mike Porter opened, Michael Porter opened the Acme. It was the first show there, I saw it. Yes. And he also opened the first show at Acme Gallery, Matt's Gallery.
Yeah, interesting.
And so, there was a time where there was a breed of people that were quite maverick. And I don't think there's mavericks out there now. People are very compliant.
Yes, but it was also the extent to which the gallery, if you like, it wasn't just a place for exhibiting art, it was a place for making art.
Exactly.
And you take the extreme example of Ron Hazelden's, which you give a beautiful commentary on. Yeah. Working 12 Days, the lifeboat piece, the piece of the boat he cut up. When the show was over, that got junked.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's such a shame. I mean, Ron did 4 brilliant, inspiring pieces at Acme. And that was because he was given the freedom, in the same way as, say, Robin Klasnick at Matt's Gallery. Okay, come in, give me a show. This is your space. How long do you need it for to use as a studio? And so you declare that, and with a negotiation with Jonathan and David, so long as they felt they weren't going to lose audience, you went in there and that became your studio. And you could go in there and play and make whatever you wanted to and test something. It became a field of inquiry. It wasn't like knock it out in the studio, back at home or whatever, and then bring it in. It was like a case of going in and working with the environment and working with site specificity and working with influences about the space and the scale of the space and what was doable and possible. And Ron produced 4 brilliant pieces. Yeah.
And your piece, 2050, am I right in thinking that you first made that in Matt's Gallery? Or
that was a Matt's Gallery situation. I mean, ironically, I had the next show after Stuart, and they closed. I'd been and seen Jonathan with Daryl Viner, and Daryl already had an idea, who manipulates who, and it was that lovely photograph you showed, which actually was a kinetic piece, and it was a square of very heavy timber supported on scaffolding upstairs that kind of waved around on a programmed arm that turned, and so it would kind of jitter and whatever. And the ropes went down through the floor and held another piece that kind of was the underbit. So it's like a puppeteer working the puppet, that kind of thing.
Through the floorboards.
Who manipulates who, yeah. In fact, I fell through those floorboards. I helped him install that work, and I cut a hole, and I stepped backwards, went right the way through and landed in the ground floor. But so I was going to have a show, and then suddenly Jonathan just decided that was it. He'd finish. But I went and saw, much later on, I went and saw Robin Klasnick at Matt's Gallery. And I actually did a piece way before the oil. The oil was way forward in time, 1987. But the first piece I did at Matt's Gallery was in 1985. And I took a foundry, built a foundry, put it in the space, built a great big mould, and poured X 100 of aluminium. So I lodged a beam in the building. I'd actually proposed it for the British art show, British sculpture show at the Haywood, and they wrote back and they couldn't believe what I'd proposed and said, "You must be mad, you can't do that kind of thing." And then I went and saw Robin and I said, "Listen, I'm not allowed to do this." He said, I'll take it. And I did it there instead.
What about throwing it open to questions? Any questions?
So I'm head of college here at LCC, so it's not really relevant to my role here, but it is quite relevant to where I've been before, at Camberwell and at Chelsea. And I think it's actually quite sad the way London's going now with the property situation. And I'm thinking particularly in Peckham, so a lot of the Camberwell students, as you probably know, sort of spread out in that area. And we've still got bold tendencies, what Hannah Barry's doing down there, and it's probably one of the few spaces left in London.
Yeah.
We've got Hotel Elephant here, which our students use, and that's quite a rough space, but that's not going to be around for much longer because of the development that's going on around here. I just wonder what's next, really, for people that are wanting to make work and to be able to experiment in that way, because they do need good, rough, ready spaces.
Yeah. Well, the word on the street, unfortunately, is everyone is saying there's nothing within the M25 in terms of studio. And ironically, I've been in a studio. It's not my best studio. I've got 3 studios, but it's not the best one. It's where I used to make, and I left it today. I was kicked out today, and it was a big, big railway arch over in Southwark, and when I moved in there was money laundering, manufacture of pound coins, and cutting cars up and welding them together again, stolen cars. And it's now microbrewery, a club is moving in, and an olive oil company. So you can see what's happened. But like New York, like Butler's Wharf, like Acme Housing, it was described like artists are like rats. They scurry in and get things going and nibble up all the rotten stuff and make it good in a funny way. And what's happened is we've made it gentrified. Very interesting way of explaining that is the director of the Icon Gallery, Jonathan Watkins, was approached by local authority in Birmingham and said, listen, Longbridge, Rover have moved out. We've got acres of land and factory. Do you want to expand your gallery? Do you want to do something? What would you do to revitalise that? And he said, give it to me, I'll turn it into studios, give me the budget to turn it into studios, because what will happen is one of the people who go in there, give it to me free, I won't take rent for 1 year. Give it to me, and I'll put artists in there, and what will happen is one of those artists will open a cafeteria, and they did. Yeah. And from that cafeteria, someone else opened a cafe, and from that, someone started showing films in the evening, and a community was generated. But that community has spawned, and slowly the artists are being outpriced because, the council go back and say, this is a happening place, we'll up the rates.
Yes, yeah.
And so you generate a situation, but you get priced out as well.
Yeah.
And, it's not that I've been strictly priced out, but it's been gentrified. All the arches have been emptied. They're all now being, not demolished, but they're all being re-sleeved and all newness that moves in the same way as, Butler's Wharf after the fire, it went quiet for 3 years. Conran bought it, nothing wrong with that necessarily, but, it meant it was no longer artist studios. It became, offices, luxury apartments and restaurants. That's what happens. You can't fight that system. But the other thing is you don't really want to plead a charity and say, can you give me a space to go and work? The local authority don't actually owe it to you. But London is horrendously expensive, and I don't know how, kids are today. I mean, my son is 23. He can't find a flat anywhere. He's on people's floors. He's been like that for a year. Sometimes on our floor. It's horrendous. It's very, very difficult. If you've got money, you can do it. If you haven't got money, it's.
It's just touching up on the. Oh, sorry. Just touching up on the location prices going up and everything. Do you think there'll be a movement or shift of artists feeling like maybe they'd want to go experiment their work somewhere else, like Bristol or Newcastle or anything like that, or do you think it'll always kind of be predominantly London?
I don't know. I mean, William might have a different view on that. I do think that, I'm a Londoner born and bred, and I needed to come back to London. I've worked in Berlin for 2 years, but I did come back to London. And it used to be that this was the only place I ever wanted to be. At my age now, I can think, you know, with an airport and the internet, I could probably survive anywhere, as long as there's an airport nearby and I've got a computer line. And I say that because my profession gets farmed out quite a bit. I don't always have hands-on, and I certainly don't run my own factory. I never wanted to be in a factory. You know, I don't mind going to other factories, but I won't run my own. So I farm a lot of work out to engineers and fabricators, and I keep all the design stuff myself. I do that with my own little team. But and in a sense, answering your question, that could be anywhere. I'm drawn to the speed of London, the hyperness of London. I've got a lot of friends in London, and my business runs very smoothly in London because I've been here all my life and I know how to run it. I think for anyone coming out of college, it is possible to go somewhere else, depending on what the type of work is. And ex-students do. They do roam off. They do go and establish other situations or stay in what is termed the regions. But, you know, Locus Plus, John Bewley, good mate of mine, he started that as the Basement Group. It became Projects UK, and then it became Locus Plus. And he's been passionate about the North East. And what he's done to Newcastle and brought, you know, great supporters of him and Newcastle, like Chris Burden from West Coast, California, coming over, doing great big shows up in the North East. Various other people in Liverpool, certainly the Glasgow scene. There are other cities, and they do have their scenes. Personally, I prefer here, but it is very difficult. London is very difficult.
Yeah, I'll answer that quickly. Just, I mean, I love London, and I've made a lot of my work about London, East London particularly. And I couldn't really imagine. I find English provincial life absolutely terrifying. I don't think I couldn't live outside of London if I stayed here.
Yeah, I know. I had a conversation the other week, and I was talking to Jock because, you know, we both got places abroad, and I was saying, you know, like, London's had it, and I quoted him. I said, you know, I'm looking around. There's nothing inside the M25. I know so many artists who are looking to get hold of a building together, or buy something, or rent and see if they can share in a group, and there is nothing. And Jock was saying, yeah, but what are you going to do? Go to Bedford to make art? You can't make art in Bedford. And in a way, you know, you laugh at that. You know, I'm sorry for anyone who's from Bedford, but in a way, I know exactly what he means about that. There is a sense of isolation, which sometimes, it's not about needing other people around, it's needing the hyperness of a situation. And I'm the same as William. You know, I love London. I love the fact it's angst-ridden, it's speedy, you know, it's congested, it's dirty. You know, it feeds my work. I make work about the urban predicament, you know, situation, and try and sort of transform it in my own way. So I need that city life. I have actually said if I wasn't in London, I'd probably go back to Berlin, or I might go to Newcastle. But that's really all I could do. But I think that gives you a sense of where my head is in terms of needing that sort of sense of busyness.
Thank you.
Oh, Kathy's got a question at the back. Oh, sorry.
It's okay. Hi. Well, first of all, I just wanted to say a huge thank you. I don't know how to everyone else, but I don't want to sound silly. I didn't hear before about Acme Studios, so to me it was educational and pretty interesting. I enjoyed the movie. Thank you to organizers as well. Another thing was exciting to me always because I work in such a gallery and we have this oil installation by Richard Wilson and we have lots of questions from customers about it. So yeah, it's just pretty exciting to meet you personally. But by coincidence as well, I am doing like project for my course, which I explore London galleries, in particular gallery spaces. I don't consider like young studios what we like touched in the movie. Like I explore more famous galleries. So the question is, how much importance do you think the actual building, the gallery, the history of that building plays on the exhibition? Like what kind of interaction, how how the space, gallery space, that building influence the actual art itself, and how important it is for the audience, how it changes their audience perception. Sorry if I sound confusing, I'm just...
It's a very interesting question, and it's a very common question for me because of what I used to do. You know, like people would say, hands up, and people would say, you know, what's the best place you've ever exhibited in? And my answer has always been the space that lets me do what I want to do as an artist. That's the best space. And I've heard other people answer, they say they like the Saatchi gallery floor, they like the Museum of Modern Art, you know, Los Angeles, and they'll talk about the lighting or the walls or Tate. That's not interesting to me. It's the space that lets you do what you want to do. And I've found through experience, the museums don't let you do what you want to do. And so I like maverick spaces, you know, and it used to be Matt's Gallery. I did 4 shows there up until 1994 or 5. And I'm a big supporter of my local gallery. I've done 2 shows there. The Cafe Gallery. Now, it's a bit of an odd space. You know, it does community shows, it does, you know, these shows, those shows. It's got no policy other than our doors are open for everybody. But what was very interesting about Ron Hennock, the director who's now standing down, is that if you wanted to do something, because he is of our generation, he understood and he would say, you do whatever you want, don't worry. If it's hit and run, we'll do hit and run. And it's coming back to that word, the maverick. It's the person that allows you, if you wish to tamper. And I say that with reservation because I've been tampering with architecture for a good part of my professional career. And I have to say, contrary to most of the early critiques of the work, which called me a architect vandal, Wilson attacks architecture again. I don't. I very sensitively choreograph architecture in that I have a very good idea about how my world stands up. And therefore, if I choose to take something of this room and do something to it, I've got to have a very good idea how to put it back. And I've always done that. And so I'm not giving carte blanche for anyone to go and sort of hammer the hell out of a building. But if I want to spin a building round, I know exactly how to do it. I'll talk to the engineers who can confirm that my idea will work, but maybe there needs to be some mathematical adjustments. We'll do it, and then we'll put it back again afterwards, if the budget allows. And so those spaces are the best ones. The derelict spaces, the spaces that allow you to do what you want to do, et cetera, et cetera. And it often, because of the nature of my previous work, I do enlist parts of the building. I mean, the oil is only a tank in a room. All you're doing is you're staring at architecture, you're staring at the room, but you're seeing the room in a very different way. You're seeing it in a room full of hazardous waste material. Now, not a lot of people allow you to do that. Charles loves it, because really, he loves it for the work, but he loves it because he's putting 2 fingers up to the bureaucracy that try and close him down all the time. And that argument about it's an artwork, you can't, you know, so... Thank you.
Can I just respond very quickly to your question? Because I was thinking, you know, well, what's the nicest place I've shown in? And I'd have to say it was a short show I did in 2004 that was organised by Mark Webber, who at that time was a research fellow working here at LCC. And he put on this massive international programme of expanded cinema in a derelict steel mill in Dortmund. And it was wonderful. Just the sheer size, the volume, interior space. It was cleared of rubbish and so on. Beautiful. You'd have liked that space.
Yeah, they're becoming so fashionable now, though, aren't they? Everyone wants that kind of space. I think it's interesting, you know, going back to the question earlier about studio space and stuff, or maybe the comments we were making. You know, like it's really now a case of looking at what the studio happens to be and whether, if you're a maker, you need to be the maker, or whether you need to oversee the making, and whether what you're making needs to be that big anymore. I mean, I say that ironically because I've just made, not intentionally, but apparently the longest permanent sculpture in Europe at Heathrow, which I think came up earlier on. I didn't make it, got made in a factory up in Hull in 23 bits. So it's that thing about, you know, does one need big spaces? Is the new studio the internet, the telephone, SoundCloud, whatever, you know? I mean, I don't quite know. Is it a virtual world for studio? I think it is changing. There are a lot of people who now do a lot of work on their phones. You know, they make films, they send it. You know, especially a new generation coming out of art college at the moment. That equipment is capable of doing quite a bit now. It's something I know very little about, and I'm, let's say, old school. You know, I still have machinery and I still make, because that's what I trained to do and I love doing. But I don't know, and that will survive, but I don't know how much more I need to have a big space to do stuff. The overheads are too much, and one's got to kind of think fast while you're running. You've got to think about how to get around those problems. Yeah, sure, if you make a bit of money suddenly, it's not a problem, but when you have a lax year, you know, you can be put on the line. You've got to start thinking. And what you do is I tend to sort of go back to drawing and model making and dealing with proposals and sitting fallow for a year, because I don't believe in churning it out. I don't believe in the production line. My motto on my T-shirt is, Richard Wilson, I'm not cheap, but I'm slow, which I think the best motto you have for work, you know. And that means, you know, I can spend 2 years model making, thinking, talking to people, getting engineers to justify that it's doable. And then when the money comes, then I'll go and I'll say, right, I've got 3 ideas, what can I do? And then, you know, an architectural practice might phone up from Hong Kong or something, you know, and then you look at that and see that you can make one piece in a year, and you can, you know, I don't believe in chasing, you know, all the time. I just like to sit back. I am in a privileged situation to be able to do that, but it's taken 40 hard years to make that happen, you know. It's not so easy for, you know, for me to preach how to do that for someone half my age, but it's doable. And I think the first thing you show is enthusiasm. And you've got to, I said earlier, you know, if you're a sculptor, you've got to know how your world stands up. A lot of people go in there on a bluff and they say, I want to do this, I want to do that, and they're not sure themselves how it's done. And I think you have to know how a structure works or can be undone. Once you know that in your head, you know how sensitive you can be with it. So you've got to be on the ball all the time.
That's Cassie at the back first, and then John? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's sort of repeating this.
Sorry, it doesn't amplify, it's merely recording for the documentation.
I see. It's repeating this question, really. Where is the art being made at the moment? And I sometimes wonder whether it's made in universities or colleges at all, and whether it's not being made at festivals or in the street or as artivism in Hong Kong or something. Or is it happening in places like Detroit that are post-industrial, where there's a very diverse population making completely different kinds of stuff, but with this exactly the energy that's displayed in this marvellous film.
Interesting
so
question.
Where is the art being made?
Yeah, I think it's a multitasking situation, isn't it? It's like, where is the art being made? What art is one looking for? You know, it's a double entendre, you've got to answer that one. And is it that one's looking for a kind of art that was generated in that period of time that kind of fell slightly fallow when Acme closed? I mean, ironically, and it's quite a laugh actually, when Acme finished, it had actually done quite a bit for a lot of those artists, and there were a couple of the, you know, the hyenas sitting around the edges, and as soon as that door closed and Acme had gone, people got snatched up by the more sort of commercial side, and what that did is it altered their approach to their work. And I'm not saying for the worse, but I did feel that work was compromised, whereas you saw with William's film that work wasn't compromised at Acme. And sure, there's loads of places. I mean, you can see art all over London. You can see art throughout Great Britain. You can see art across Europe. We've had Frieze, that's gone to Frac in France. You know, the art fair is global. You can see art there. But it's the kind of work you want to see. Will you see the happening? I've not seen any happening since it disappeared out of New York way back. You know, you go to the Arts Council and say, I want a grant to do a happening, they'll say, yeah, where's it touring? You say, I don't know. It hasn't happened yet. I don't know if it's going to happen again. It's that kind of thing. Those kind of bureaucratic questions jeopardize certain artworks and leave it fallow and only allow a certain other type of work to exist, which is the object, the painting, the more established genres, which tend to work only in the domestic market. A lot of the museums don't have a lot of big money. There's not a lot of big stuff being sold. There's very big interest in, I hate the word public art, but works that are out in the public domain, let's say, and that's through corporate industry. You know, people want to brand themselves and they will use the artist and use the artwork to do that. Whether that's good or not, I don't know. I have been employed in that genre, and you will see big pieces of sculpture, airports, certainly gateways to cities, that kind of thing. But sort of circuitous route, go back, I'm throwing the question back, you know, it's like, what art do you want to see? Yes, a certain amount has disappeared. What I find invigorating, having said that, is that I think there's a resurgence of artists working across genres. So they're making sculpture, but there's a sound element and maybe even a live element. And it's very much to do with a very young group coming through. And it's been assisted by ex-students from Chelsea who founded Otto, Cafe Otto, putting on sound stuff there, and it's a place I go regularly to, having been in the old scene in the 70s, 80s, and been into sound myself and travelled the world doing that. And it disappeared in the 90s. There was nowhere for improvised musicians, etc. And that's now coming way back. And you've got, you know, Listen Gallery with Haroum doing that kind of work. You've got, you know, you've got classical commercial galleries taking on that kind of art base, which is across boundaries, cross territories, cross borders. It's not just the one thing, it's that encompassing light, writing, you know, ephemerality, site specificity, installation. And I think that's interesting.
John was next.
Hi. I was wondering about the interview process that came up in the film, and it kind of sounds like maybe quite a cozy arrangement if you got in. You know, you had a space, and a lot of the artists who had space had shows. I'm wondering if there's anyone we might have heard of who didn't get an Acme space, why that might have been, and and what their kind of options would have been. Somebody mentioned the difficulty in kind of finding housing through the proper channels, but yeah, I'm kind of wondering if there's this this salon des refusés of kind of artists who weren't accepted by the kind of by Jonathan. I can't remember the other.
Wow, that's an interesting question.
I don't know anyone. There were other operations, you know, like Space, and you could apply there and you'd get a studio. And remember, in that 70s, I don't know what it's like now, but there was a big squat scene because there was so much property. So you could, if you were an artist, you aimed towards Acme to get legitimised, or like me, you know, I squatted, and there was an amnesty, we all got kicked out, and anyone getting kicked out would be given a room in a tower block. But Jonathan gave me the keys back. So there were people squatting as artists and doing their own thing. But Acme really was central to East London. They weren't doing anything in West. They were doing a bit up in North London, weren't really South and West.
There were a couple of
it was East and South East.
Would people have been rejected for aesthetic reasons?
Well, I think your question's really interesting.
Don't know about that.
And one of the things I wanted to show, I mean, there were certain people I wanted to include in the film that, to be honest with you, Acme weren't very happy about. I mean, I was trying to keep, in a way, trying to make this film, I was trying to keep Acme off my back because Jonathan did say, you've got a free hand here, but then every time he came along to a viewing, he said, well, that's not right, you know. And the problem is that, unlike Jonathan has because it's his organisation that he's been so passionately involved with for 40 years and more, he feels that there is a definitive history. And there are certain things, you know, you can't say that, William, because it's not true. That kind of approach. But so, I mean, that made me sort of go and seek out people to talk to who would not, at that stage, when they got an Acme house, have described themselves as artists. And the person I'm thinking of is Cozy Fanny Tutti, who was with Genesis P. Orridge.
Beck Road.
Yeah. But of course, the thing is that this is not, Jonathan would deny this story, but what I heard from Genesis and from Cozy was that they were the first people to move into Beck Road. They'd made some friends who were already squatting a house in that street in Hackney, and those people moved out, so Cozy and Genesis moved in, round about the same time as they did that, a little earlier than they had that big prostitution show at the ICA. And then they went to Acme to legitimize their, you know, the license on the house, so that they weren't squatters that could be easily evicted. So they became accepted as part of the Acme community. And I think a lot of people got houses like that. So I don't know about you, Richard, but I don't think that there was any kind of obvious aesthetic policy on the work of people wanting to be housed. I didn't feel
Who was it who said they took their portfolio? I don't...
Ron Hazelden.
Ron
Take
Hazelden.
along your portfolio.
I can't ever remember. I mean, I probably got there through a circuitous route, but I can't ever remember anyone going along with a portfolio. I know you just went along and you said, I want a studio, and they say, there's the list, put your name down. And it was casual like that. And you'd think, can I rub those names out and put mine in there? You know? All devious means to get to the top of the list. But, you know, I mean, God, dare I say, we need a cull now. I mean, there weren't a lot of artists around. I was going to say that, you know, when you saw those wonderful early shots of, that would have been Devon's Road, wouldn't it? Where the camera pans, and it's just corrugated iron after corrugated iron, boarded up property, boarded. I don't think at one point there was that many artists on the list, and it was like, well, what one do you want? I think latterly, as property ran out, there might have been a structure where they did have to, you know, like keep people hanging around on the list, or sort of say, well, you're only on it for 3 years. If you don't find your own situation, you might have to go off. But earlier on, if you wanted a house, you got one pretty immediately. You know, you could pick what you wanted. There was so much of it. The whole docks had finished. All those dockers' houses were empty. Like I said in my interview, you know, when I had to rebuild my house, St James's Road was all derelict. There was no one in there. It was all due for demolition, but it was up for like 3 or 4 years. And I don't think Acme ever took any of it.
No.
It just was surplus to requirement.
The only problem was you had to give up your artistic practice and learn the building trade.
Yeah.
And do your own plumbing and wiring. And
Yeah. I think actually 1 or 2 people did get a house and give up doing art, and I think they stayed there, you know. They pretended, perhaps, but I knew a couple of people around southeast London. But, yeah. No, it's an interesting one. I think it's not one that's for us to answer. I think it's probably one that, if you see Jonathan any time in the street, just take him to one side and say, I'm just curious to know. I'm curious to know now. I'm going to do that with Jonathan. He's my neighbour. I think one thing that I don't know if I said on my interview, but I keep thinking of it as a story, is that what was lovely about St James's Road, all that dereliction where I went and got all my stuff for my house, is that these old houses were dockers' houses. The docks had finished. Those people were quite elderly. They decided to leave London. They all moved. They all went to Sandy and Bedfordshire and places like that because they weren't artists. But what was amazing is these places got boarded up and they sat for years empty. And there's 2 things. One is something that Stuart mentioned, is that the sound of East London and South East London in the rain was quite extraordinary. Rain hitting metal. But the other thing for me, which was quite extraordinary, going round nicking stuff out of all the derelict houses, is that the dockers had been proud owners of their gardens, and particularly their front gardens. They had little strips, you know, with old bits of wood as a fence. And what happened is they'd gone, the places were boarded up, but every summer, because we'd had good rains in the spring, the gardens would come out. So you had the most wonderful roses and sunflowers and everything else in these boarded up houses. And there was this odd thing of a past still breaking through and growing along with the dereliction. You know, you'd see a house, the roof had gone in, the front garden was beautiful. It was quite extraordinary, that. And that went on for a couple of years. And then slowly it became overgrown and, you know, trashed, and people would just fly tip. You know, lorry would come along and shoot a pile of bricks in. But the first couple of years were fascinating. I even thought one time when I was getting floorboards, I thought, how do I get these roses? My place didn't have a garden, but, you know, I thought, they're so beautiful, I must have them. Nowhere to put them.
Thank you.
Can I ask everybody to just thank William and Richard for a fascinating couple of hours. William, brilliant film.
Yeah.
I think I've got the record at the moment, apart from William, of having seen it 4 times.
Wow.
And I've just spotted somebody else in the film, and I'm saying, is that so-and-so? So every time I see it, I see something different. But thank you, William, because it's a brilliant film.
Thank you.
So lucky to have him as well. And thank you to Richard as well. Some fascinating insights there to such an interesting
It's nice to
period.
reminisce.
And, yeah, thank you. And thanks everybody for coming. Really nice audience. Thank you.